The Earth has recorded its hottest days ever. Climate is changing. Colin Polsky and Kate Stein tell us what this means. The hurricane season is off to a quick start. Michael Lowry brings things into focus. This is NTWC Live.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to NTWC Live for Wednesday, July the 12th. Glad to have you all with us today. We're almost all back in the saddle. Dr. Hal Needham will be with us in the second half hour, along with all of our guests. And Bill Reed is with us, of course, this morning as well. Before we get to everybody and all of our guests, we want to thank our sponsors who make this program a reality. USAA. Boy, thank you, USAA. We appreciate your continued support of NTWC Live and of the National Tropical Weather Conference. You guys have been a part of what we've been doing for a very long time, and we appreciate that. The South Padre Island Convention and Visitors Bureau. South Padre Island is the host for the in-person National Tropical Weather Conference held every year in April on South Padre Island. So thanks to the SPI Convention and Visitors Bureau for your support. The Weather Company and Weather Boy, all supporters of NTWC Live. We'll thank them again a little bit later in the program. Big program for us today. I think this is going to be fascinating, the conversations we're going to have, and to lead those conversations is none other than the former director of the National Hurricane Center, Mr. Bill Reed. Good morning, Bill. Good to see you this morning.
Good morning, Tim, and everybody. Glad to be here. The last time we were on the air, I was enjoying 52-degree morning temperatures, drinking coffee at our place in New Mexico at 6,500 feet, and questioning my sanity from ever coming back into the 90s and low 80 dew points we've been experiencing lately. Second, Tim, I think we got a great show. We got a lot of interesting stuff. One of our guests I know very well, but our first two are new to me, so I'm fascinated to get started with them. First off, they're going to be a team talk to us on what they've been working on. First is one participant is Kate Stein, as a climate learning and engagement specialist at the insurance broker WTW based in London. She translates climate science and insurance concepts for decision makers in the public and private sectors, and facilitates collaboration among diverse stakeholders, including climate scientists, insurance, government officials, development experts, and grassroots community stakeholders. With her is Dr. Colin Polsky. He's a professor of geosciences, founding director of the Florida Atlantic University School of Environmental, Coastal, and Ocean Sustainability. As you might suspect, Dr. Polsky is a climate social scientist, examining how people create, perceive, and respond to climate challenges. I'm pretty sure I speak for just about everybody else. Is one of our biggest challenge as the physical science meteorologists has been how to personalize aspects of climate change in specifics, but weather in general. That's the whole idea of communicating the threats and aspects of weather has been a subject of a lot of discussion. So I'm going to let you take it away and tell us what you do, and then we'll follow up with some questions.
Thank you, Bill and Tim and Alex and the whole gang for putting on this great opportunity to share some of the perspectives that I have as an academic in South Florida, and that my colleague Kate Stein, who's been working in this field in South Florida, but now in London, some of her perspectives as well. So I'll just get right into it, and I appreciate the introduction, so we can skip that part that we had planned. The problem, simply put here, as the title of the presentation suggests, the climate change and the cost of insuring our homes, is that the cost of insuring our homes is going up, and it is linked with climate change. That may be self-evident, but in recent days even, and certainly in recent months, the press has been reporting on one after another major insurance company, in some cases smaller insurance companies, stopping to write policies. In some cases, they're leaving the state of Florida or California or Louisiana entirely. In other cases, they're honoring their existing policies, but they're refusing to write new ones. So the bottom line is that for homeowners and it trickles down to renters, I believe. The cost of insuring our homes, both homeowners policies and flood insurance in particular, is going up. And in some places, it's becoming even not accessible. So this is a profound challenge. One of the, in the literature on climate change impacts and responses, one of the foundational adaptations for people is to climate challenges is to take insurance. Not everybody can afford it, but for those of us who can, it's the natural thing to do. It's kind of a top 5 thing to consider. But the market is failing, and there are some reasons for that, and it's definitely worth paying attention to. Premiums here and where I live in Florida have gone up a good 50% and may continue to go up in that pace in the coming couple of years. And that's just tough for anybody. Anyway, the reasons, we've identified 4 reasons. I'll just list them quickly here in the interest of time. Number 1 is the cost per event, that is extreme weather event, seems to be going up. And certainly it's hard to expect insurance companies to be able to handle losses, to cover losses of the magnitude that we've seen here in Florida, at least in recent years, with, for example, Hurricanes Michael and Ian, just to name 2 of the more recent ones. These are tremendously costly events, and their business model is to pay out damages, but hopefully from their perspective, they're receiving more money in premiums than they're paying out. And that's kind of been turned upside down, at least in some high risk states like Florida, Louisiana, and California. The frequency and intensity of the extreme events in the coming years, we expect to get worse, get more challenging due to climate change. That's kind of an old staple of the climate change theory playbook, and it feels like it's unfolding now before us in practice in real time. A bit unrelated to climate change, but it's not completely unrelated, is the, at least in Florida, the question of litigation and fraud in the insurance industry. So bottom line is there's a handful of reasons that costs are rising if you're an insurance provider. And it appears to be rising so quickly that some major players are exiting the market. We could also talk here, and I'll conclude before handing it over to Kate with this section, is that there are subsidies in the market. We could talk about flood insurance in particular, and subsidies kind of cut both ways. You know, from an economist's perspective, a subsidy is a signal that it's distorting the true cost, or in this case, the true risk of living in a certain location. And that's not good. On the other hand, it is good if you happen to live there and you've adjusted your finances and your family's livelihood based on what you expect to pay for the insurance. So in any case, there's a lot of dynamic currents here in the market across the country. There's a few bellwether states they're very important, where there's some big challenges unfolding. So Kate is in the industry. I'll pass it over to her with that.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Colin. And thank you all for having us here today. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about all of this. Bear with me, Colin, because I think it might be good actually to deviate a bit from sort of what you and I had talked about beforehand. And I'd love to just hear from Bill, sort of, I mean, we're speaking today, you know, for an audience of meteorologists and people who work as broadcasters. My background is as a climate journalist. I was a climate radio journalist for WLRN in Miami before making my way over to London, because I really wanted to be engaged in the insurance industry and kind of connecting the dots between climate risk, changes to insurers' decisions about what they will or will not underwrite, where they'll offer policies. But then that has, as Colin alluded to, really significant effects for people who are sort of on the front lines, probably many of your viewers, when it comes down to what they're paying for insurance. And so I guess there's things that I can talk about when it comes to sort of why the insurance industry is making these decisions that Colin covered a bit already. But I'd really be curious, Bill, to maybe just turn it back to you and just hear, are there particular questions on your mind or that you've heard from members or others that you're engaging with when it comes to what's happening with insurance and climate. And I think Colin and I would be happy to address those before kind of moving along to the points that we kind of plotted out in advance.
Okay, I can give you a couple of it's anecdotal observations on my part from just talking to real people that are faced with the problems. The affordability factor, it's really stacking up on people. The down here, at least, the value of the properties being insured has been escalating upward, and the insurance rates are escalating even faster upward. So they're facing 25 to 40% higher premiums on the same property that they had a few years ago. And it's creeping up higher and higher into the middle class structure of where it's just not affordable. What are you going to roll the dice on the insurance so that you can pay the mortgage and buy food for your family? The same token on the flood insurance issue, the changes that are coming in the flood insurance program to make it more actuarially sound, it's still subsidized. I suspect it's still actuarially below what the rates would dictate, the science would dictate for them. There already is a poor participation in that insurance, and yet it sounds like more and more people are going to be opting out because of the cost. Those are the two things that the currents that I hear in the background on the insurance issue here in Texas.
Right. And that's a real catch-22, because on the one hand, insurance companies, in order to stay in business and not have to withdraw, like in Florida, there's been a lot of challenges lately in the last few years with insurance companies not being able to stay solvent and be able to even provide policies in Florida, because they can't. They go out of business. The losses can be too great, and they aren't able to charge premiums that are high enough to cover costs after storms like Ian and others that have been so incredibly damaging. Matthew. On the other hand, people can't spend all their money on insurance because they need to be able to eat and, pay just to cover the costs of life. And so I think it's a really difficult situation that climate change is compounding, as climate intensifies, storms and heat waves and wildfire risk, all of that. So it's a really sticky situation that we're in at the moment. And I think the way that you put it just now, Bill, is really quite clear and very kind of relatable to a lot of people in Florida, California, Louisiana, and across the US who are experiencing these kinds of challenges. So yeah, we can talk a bit about solutions, but Colin, I don't know if you have anything that you want to add to that before we continue the conversation.
Well, just briefly, I would expand the question from the flood insurance perspective is really kind of interesting, just looking at the last 15 years or so. So everyone's known for a while that the National Flood Insurance Program is subsidized. The rates don't reflect the true risk. And then we have a Hurricane Katrina and so on that spurs Congress to say, listen, what we got to do is adjust the rates to reflect the risk. And so then they enacted, for example, the Bigger Waters Act of 2012, which was signed into law before Hurricane Sandy, which just underscored the need to bring rates into alignment with risk. Then, of course, Congress backtracked because they heard, from their constituents that they don't want to see the rates increase. Well, now we're seeing a risk rating 2.0. Rates need to reflect true risk again, and Congress backtracking again. And it's kind of, I'm not casting judgment here. It's like, it's natural. People want the true risk, but not when it applies to changing their personal situation. It's a mess. I'll just leave it at that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, Bill, I don't know if you have specific questions beyond that you want us to cover off. Otherwise, I can talk a bit about sort of how the insurance industry is thinking about all this, because I know, we're experiencing this as consumers and people trying to buy insurance, but it's different to hear, I think, kind of the logic behind it. But I'll let you lead if you have any other questions that you wanted to ask us.
This will probably lead right into what you're getting ready to talk about. But the the question I had is there a scientific method in the insurance industry to calculate how much of their increased damage losses is due to climate change versus how much is just the natural occurrence of events, natural disasters?
That's a really, really good question. And I think that my colleagues who have a meteorology background could probably speak in a way that's a bit more eloquent than I can to an audience of meteorologists, but I'll do my best with that one. So the insurance industry has long used what's called catastrophe risk modeling since about Hurricane Andrew in 1992. And basically, these models use historical data to assess the likelihood and potential like financial losses of different kinds of disasters, whether that's hurricanes or wildfires, also terrorism, and there's work being done on cyber risk as well, so cyber attacks. The problem or the challenge with these models is that they are based on historical data. And so one of the main issues that the insurance industry is grappling with when it comes to climate change is trying to figure out how to what's called condition catastrophe models to incorporate forward-looking data or projections on that come from sort of global climate models and looking at what the effects of climate change are on, say, intensity of hurricanes, and then in turn how that affects the potential losses for an insurance company. So work is underway on adjusting models to climate change, but it's by all means not settled. It's not kind of figured out how to do this in a way that both captures sort of the losses and of specific events and how those affect or insurers, but also capture sort of some of this future-looking data. And part of this comes down to timescale. Climate change is obviously occurring over decades, and catastrophe models tend to be more oriented toward the duration of an insurance contract, which in property and casualty insurance is a year. So to date, there hasn't been a huge amount of incentive for the insurance industry to even be thinking about climate change, except now that we're starting to see, wildfires and hurricanes in particular intensify. And so there's been, I think, a growing appetite to understand how specific storms or specific wildfires might be modeled effectively. But there's a lot of work to be done as far as bringing together these sort of like catastrophe models that are very short term with larger longer time frame climate risk models that also tend to work on a much less granular resolution than catastrophe risk models do. So yeah, that's sort of the state of things when it comes to climate modeling in the insurance industry. Still very much sort of being figured out as we speak.
That's okay. Then that answered a question I had. Was it basically what to sum it up would be my homeowner's insurance policy went up, but it's based on the same type of factors that they would have been calculating it all along on what's happened over the past. So the increases in cost of materials, the increased losses over the previous year are what affect the rates.
It's not just that, though. It's so the insurance industry, we think about buying our policies from insurance companies, but those companies also have insurance, which is called reinsurance. So insurance for insurers. And because of 2017 with hurricanes hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria, and just overall 2017 had a lot of natural or not entirely natural disasters that caused a really significant increase in just kind of starting reinsurance prices to climb. And then more recently with the pandemic, with inflation, with the disasters like Hurricane Ian, those have all, and lots of wildfires as well, those have all driven up the costs of insurance for insurers, and then they pass those increases along to consumers. So that's a really significant driver of increases in insurance prices as well. The fact that reinsurance prices are rising and insurers have to charge more in order to offset that. So Colin, you're off mute. Sorry. I feel like I'm taking up a lot of airtime here. So anything you want to add to that?
No, it's great. I guess there were a couple additional things I might say that in addition to what Kate said in response to your question. Number one is I think the insurance and reinsurance industry probably in the immediate doesn't care as much if the current big losses are due to climate change or not. It's just that the current losses are really, really big and they exceed the revenue that they get. And if they see that as they have over a space of not 1 year, but the last decade, it's been really tough, then they have to make some hard business decisions and raise rates or just leave the market. But of course, the question of climate change is in the backs of their minds. And I can also say that an interesting story with Risk Rating 2.0 for the National Flood Insurance Program, as I mentioned earlier, in the last year, they've come out with announced rate increases or decreases for properties across the country. And in the modeling is an expectation that future conditions, climate will be different than the historical record. That was the basis for some congressmen recently to sue the federal government to stop using that model. So the issue is there mathematically and research-wise and operationally, the climate question into the future, the climate change, but it is contested, and the outcome of this back and forth is to be determined.
That's interesting. Yeah, in my mind, one of the more definitive changes due to climate change that we will be seeing is the increased frequency of heavy rainfall, just the nature of the beast. And there's not that much uncertainty of that compared to the hurricane problem. But it's all politicized, so it's very tough to make that happen. So then I guess we get to the important thing would be what kind of solutions do you see for this? I mean, to me, it looks like the road is going the wrong way, especially in rapidly developing coastal areas like Texas and Florida.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't feel like an incredibly positive and optimistic time at the moment. I'll grant you that. I think from my perspective, and Colin, I know you'll jump in on this as well, but there are a few things that are underway. So first of all, government has started to play a more and more important role in helping retain insurers and keep prices lower than they might be in climate vulnerable areas. So we've talked about this with the National Flood Insurance Program and how that is subsidized, even though it doesn't feel like it a lot of the time. In Florida, the state government has recently put a bunch of money toward reinsurance, basically to a reinsurance fund that will help insurers it'll give them a bit extra basically in the event of a catastrophe so that they don't have to pass on quite so much of an increase in prices to consumers. So there's efforts like that underway. And so government is really stepping in a bit more, I think, and it's kind of serving as an insurer of last resort. And that has pros and cons, right? Because when it does that, that means that costs often get passed along to taxpayers. But that is one thing that we've been seeing a lot of. Also in California, the state government there has recently mandated that insurers who are writing homeowners and property insurance policies in California, they have to take into account measures that property owners are taking in order to harden their properties against wildfire. And so that's a change that's underway where in order to provide property and casualty insurance in California, you actually have to be accounting for the adaptations that homeowners are making, which is quite significant because, that's a really good example of an intervention that benefits consumers on the one hand, right? You protect your property from wildfire. There's less likely to be quite so severe damage if you're, for example, managing the forestry around your property better. On the other hand, it also benefits the insurance industry. And I think because, the losses can be reduced, maybe you go from losing a home entirely to, tens of thousands of dollars of smoke damage, which still isn't ideal, but it's a lot better than having to replace a home that's been completely burnt out. So I think there are some interventions like that underway. There's also efforts underway to bring in more capacity or basically money to support climate resilience from the insurance industry perspective. So looking at bringing in like new types of insurance solutions, catastrophe bonds, insurance linked securities, which are like kind of jargony, but basically, again, make it possible for insurers to have other sources of money coming in from investors rather than just passing along costs to consumers. So that's quite important. There are also other new types of insurance products, like parametric insurance, community-based insurance. These are all things that are a bit different to our traditional models, and can basically make it easier for insurance payouts to come more quickly. In some cases, it might be possible for donors or others to intervene and negotiate a discount for communities, that sort of thing as well. So those are a few of the things that are underway. But I think a key in all of this is that kind of communities and individuals needs to be aware of how kind of why insurance is changing, and then be able to take steps to protect their properties against these changes, and then have their insurers account for those steps. So like I said, in California, where if you harden your property against wildfire, your insurer gives you credit for it. That's quite new thinking, honestly. And so the more that we can kind of advocate for that, the better, I think, both for consumers and then also for the insurance industry, and maybe making it possible for them to stay in a place where previously it just felt kind of overwhelming and there was a bit of a stigma attached to it. So Colin, I don't know if you have anything to add to that on the solutions side. By all means.
Just to expand on the question in Florida and Louisiana, at least, I think though that you'll find it also in North Carolina, but the state government has stood up an insurer of last resort, and it's run by the state. And in Florida and Louisiana, incidentally, it's called Citizens Insurance. So this was an adaptation that I think history will record as having been successful. It didn't exist before Hurricane Andrew in 1992. After that wake-up call, when a lot of people and businesses said, we're going to leave the state, we're obviously unprepared for things we should be prepared for, the state said, wait, don't leave. We'll create an insurer of last resort. And so that's been successful. On the other hand, today, the stress on that entity needs to be monitored. And so, for example, with the insurers leaving, the number of policies that Florida's Citizens program has increased by 50%, I think, in the last year or so. It is expected to increase another 50% in the coming year or so. So is that a good outcome where the market is dominated by a single state-run entity? Maybe. We'll see. How long could that status be maintained without the market kind of really negatively reacting? We don't know. It's not meant to be the monopoly. It's meant to be a backstop. So here we are in the midst of this drama unfolding, and we don't know exactly how it's going to end. But there is some reason for hope, I would say, with the success story after Hurricane Andrew.
That is interesting. We have a similar thing over here in Texas. Its acronym is TWIA, Texas Windstorm Insurance Association, and the thing that my story on that is our previous house was built in the 1980s, and not a single insurer that I knew the name of would cover windstorm for us after Andrew. We bought a newer house, and the city was very proactive in following the latest building codes. And much to my surprise, my insurance company, our sponsor, by the way, USAA, came back to me and said, with this house, we can cover you for wind. So I think I would hope that would work in South Florida with your tougher building codes, at least for new construction, that you can get them out of the catastrophe pool that the state has to run into a more traditional insurer.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's really an example of a successful kind of alignment. What you referred to as far as Florida's building codes in particular, where, it became clear in the aftermath of Hurricane Andrew that strengthening the building codes and making sure that buildings were built to a higher standard benefited not only kind of the individuals and the owners of those buildings, but also the insurance industry. And I think the bottom line for me is that we need a lot more of that kind of collaborative thinking between and public-private partnerships, and thinking about how government and the insurance industry, can work together, creating policy and like a regulatory environment and opportunities to experiment with that kind of thinking. But I think a really important step to making that happen is communication and awareness. And to me, that's sort of the role that I see people in your positions playing as meteorologists and public communicators, explaining these issues that are so complex and like so kind of abstract and feel very removed from people's everyday lives, explaining it in a way that kind of connects these dots for them. And for myself, and I'm sure for Colin as well, we're happy to be a resource and to have communication, to communicate with you or talk with you offline, and we can share our email addresses, et cetera, to brainstorm on how to convey these really key messages, because I think it's unfortunate that it's taken these massive changes and costs to consumers for awareness of this to start increasing. But I think now is a really particularly important moment for clear communication on these issues and how they're interconnected, and toward driving some of the solutions that we've been talking about. So if there are ways that I or we can help with that, definitely happy to put my hand up.
Bill, let me jump in here, and we're coming up on 10:30, so we need to move on to the next conversation. This has been an important and fascinating conversation about the whole insurance situation, and you've answered the questions that have come in online. Questions coming in are things like, what can we do to alleviate this problem in Florida? And another is to explain the reinsurance situation. You've done that as well. So thank you for answering the questions that we've already gotten. Coming up shortly, Mike Lowry is going to be with us. But Bill, why don't we do a tropical update, and then we'll thank our sponsors again, then we'll move on. And I think by then, Dr. Hal Needham will be with us as well. And I have a hunch we may come back to a little insurance once he gets here. But Bill, bring us up to speed on what's going on in the tropics.
We'll do it. I'm sure Michael will correct me if I'm off base on this, because he's probably looked at it more than I have. Let me share the screen here real quick. And I get to still play meteorologist at this job, Michael. That's why I keep doing it. It's actually fairly quiet. The Atlantic is in its typical July mode of a dearth of convection in the Caribbean and Gulf right now. I don't have the imagery on the dust, but there's dust streaming across the tropical Atlantic into the Caribbean off of Sahara, which is fairly typical for July. A bunch of stuff up here that I'll show you the latest outlook right after this from NHC that may or may not have some tropical or subtropical characteristics in a few days. We have one storm going on. Calvin, I keep trying to call it Colin because of our guest today. I guess it's Calvin. I'll get that right. Bottom line, we've got up to 50% chance that a marginal storm could form out in the open Atlantic, and the steering currents are rather diffuse, and it keeps it in the open Atlantic until it drifts northward over colder water and most likely becomes extratropical again, and we don't have to talk about it. Calvin is a very classical, typical storm for the Eastern Pacific. It's on a westward track over the open waters of the Pacific. It is forecast to reach hurricane intensity and stay that way for a couple days until it gets into slightly less favorable conditions late this weekend or early next week. And I think I've got a loop for the satellite there, and you can see the convection on this one compared to previous ones is getting a little better organized. There's some banding on the north side now, and a pretty solid ball of convection going on down south. So back to you, Tim. You're muted.
I'm working on it, pushing all the buttons so we get it right. Thanks, Bill. Interesting, the picture of the Pacific with Calvin out there. It's just a reminder that there's more than one season, the one of the Atlantic, the one we all focus on here. By the way, Katie, I'm going to find a way to get this to you. Say thank you for coming today. I found this in an old drawer. What did you say? It costs probably more than it's worth to ship it to you. Is that what you said?
Yeah, definitely, especially since I can't use it in England.
Yeah, exactly.
Got to go to France.
Just go across the border. What's the exchange rate now? I don't even know. Anyway, good to have you guys with us, and we appreciate the conversation. We want to thank our sponsors who, once again, have made this program a possibility. We've been doing this basically since the pandemic. Our annual conference on South Padre Island kind of took a break. We took a break from the in-person in March of 2020. We were still a go, and then all of a sudden the bottom fell out, and we had to make a quick transition to being virtual. And even though we're doing the conference live again in April, we're still doing these weekly sessions, NTWC Live, and we couldn't do this without folks like USAA. USAA has been a part of all the programs we do at the Storm Science Network. We've done programs for kids over the years. They've been part of that. And of course, we do the National Tropical Weather Conference and a number of other things. And USAA has been a part of that. We appreciate that just tremendously. So thanks to USAA. South Padre Island Convention and Visitors Bureau. Once we said we needed to do a conference in person live a dozen years ago and proposed doing it on South Padre Island, they jumped in and said, we want to support that. We want to be here for you and help you host the conference. And we appreciate that. And we will be back on South Padre Island again at the Courtyard Marriott in April of 2024. So we hope you all can join us there. Thanks to all who have been there before. Also, the Weather Company and Weather Boy, important part of what we do. Weather Company's been part of it for a long time. And of course, Weather Boy coming in with scholarships for college students to come to the event. College students from anywhere in the U.S. Or continental U.S. or Hawaii have been able to join us. And we've had a number over the last couple of years come, all expenses paid trip, thanks to Weather Boy. So they're a big part of what we do as well. So thanks to all of our sponsors who make this a possibility. He's here now. He's an extreme weather and disaster scientist for CNC Catastrophe and National Claims. Let's say good morning to Dr. Hal Needham. Good morning, Dr. Hal. How are you?
Hey, good morning, y'all. Sorry I'm a little bit late, but I'm so excited to join the discussion this morning.
Good to have you along. You missed the insurance discussion, but you knew it all anyway, so it's okay. It's okay. Why don't you take a minute and introduce Mike Lowry, and then we'll get started with that.
Hey, everyone. Guys, I thought Bill was going to do the introduction.
Well, you can do that if you'd like. Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, sure. It says here on my notes that Lowry has 20 years of experience in tropical weather activities, which means I caught him at an early part of his career. He was a employee with our storm surge unit for I don't know, a couple of years, wasn't it, Michael, at NHC back in the 2008 to 2010 time frame, and would have loved to have kept him there. He's got a lot of talent, and he's done some work with FEMA. Now he's in the media world. He's down at KPLG, following in the footsteps of icons like Max Mayfield, and I guess Brian Norcross was after Max there, and now you've got the tropical specialist there. It's a great thing for the station to have there, and I like the blog post you put out every day. It's I know it's somewhat tailored to Florida, but you give a lot of interesting information. So tell us about what you're doing these days, Michael.
Sure. Well, thank you all for having me. And it was a lot of fun to be back in South Padre this year with you all for the annual meeting. It's been a little bit for me, especially with the pandemic having gone on and curtailing our travel a little bit. So it was good to see all the familiar faces. As Bill, as you mentioned, I'm with WPLG in Miami, the ABC affiliate down there, and have been there since last hurricane season. I came from FEMA, where I was heading up their response and short-term recovery planning group, sort of overseeing all of the disaster response planning that FEMA does for the southeastern United States. Really interesting position that I had there with them, and got to see a lot. A lot of activity during my time with FEMA and being on the ground in the aftermath of Hurricane Michael and Hurricane Florence, and I mean spent months in the disaster areas after these big major hurricanes, and we learned a lot. We always do from hurricanes. We try to put that into writing and to make our planning better and to do, to be a little more efficient and to get the resources to the people that need them next go round. So, these days if you're in Miami, you see me on air pretty much most days of the hurricane season, giving like kind of what you did just now, Bill, giving the tropical update, minute, 2 minutes, if things are quiet. And then if things are not quiet, then you just see my face all the time on air. So for better or for worse, feast or famine a little bit. It's been I know you all had sort of invited me on to talk a little bit about what's been going on so far this hurricane season. It's been a really interesting, it kind of always is to me, but maybe because I love this stuff, but it's been a really interesting start to the hurricane season. I kind of like, look, what are the big stories this hurricane season? And so far, I mean, the standout has been the record warmth in the Atlantic. And it's not that, I mean, an El Nino obviously is a big story, and we'll come back to that, but it's not that just that the Atlantic is a little bit warmer than average. I mean, I download this data, I look at it every day, and it's head and shoulders hotter than it's ever been in the Atlantic. And it's a kind of a unique situation where we have what appears to be, probably going to get into a strong El Nino by the time we get to the peak months of the hurricane season. And then we have this warmth in the Atlantic that's kind of want to counteract that a little bit in terms of the normal hostile conditions that El Nino would create in the Atlantic. If it's okay with you, I'm just going to jump really quickly to some graphics just to help people sort of visualize what's going on here across the tropics. This is a daily snapshot of the sea surface temperature anomaly, so the departure from average. You're not seeing really a good representation of the entire year or the entire hurricane season, but it's sort of the similar pattern where we have this record warmth that goes from the Azores down into the tropics and into the Caribbean. And that sort of horseshoe shaped appearance to the warmth generally would in any other year without an El Nino tell us that we're probably going to have a lot of storms come the peak months of the hurricane season. And reasons or the pattern that has facilitated this sort of record warmth has been weaker than average Azores high pressure or Bermuda high pressure sort of seesaws, depending on what part of the year we're in. And we've had, in a typical June, we would have very strong trade winds across the deep tropics from a strong high pressure system. But this June, that high pressure system has been the weakest we've seen in the record books. I think the group at the ECMWF said that this was the weakest going back to the 1940s that the Azores high has been. And that has greatly reduced the trade winds across the Atlantic. And then on top of that, we've had less dust coming off of Africa, the Saharan air layer. And with less dust, you're not getting as much of that bouncing back of the solar radiation. And so you have more warming of the ocean. So the combination of sort of reduced ocean mixing and the low dust has really led to that record warmth that we've seen in the Atlantic. And so I guess the big question is, what is this? How does this look for the hurricane season? Phil Klotzbach, a good friend of the show and of the conference, he and I have been talking the last few weeks about, his forecast and his rationale. And it's interesting, sort of his take, which is that it's not so much that the wind shear is going to be reduced because of the impacts on the upper part of the atmosphere, but it's really the reduction of the trade winds that is going to help to reduce the wind shear that he's sort of thinking for the peak months of the hurricane season. And that's why, the group in Colorado State's being so, aggressive in their forecast this year. The bottom line, as we all know, it only takes one hurricane to make a bad year. And so I don't get too worked up over the seasonal hurricane forecast, but it's always a really interesting conversation. It certainly matters more to us who are in the industry and whose jobs are impacted by more frequent hurricanes. But, bottom line is everybody at the coast should be preparing, as they typically would during any hurricane season. So I don't know. I just kind of leave it that as sort of a quick overview of things. But, if we want to chat a little more about this or take any viewer questions, I'd be happy to do so.
It's very interesting that there's so many other aspects of the higher sea surface temperatures. It's contributing to the incredibly high heat indexes that you're experiencing over there, as well as here in Texas, and probably throughout the Caribbean is probably having record warm overnight lows. See, one question I had when I saw your graphic there on the sea temperatures, any speculation as to the contribution of the extreme warmth of the water off New England to the flooding that they just recently had, flooding rain event they had in New York State and Vermont?
Back to that graphic. Yeah, no, that's an interesting point, Bill, and especially the last. I don't have the graphic with me, but I did create a plot that showed the sea surface temperature anomalies for the past 2 weeks, and this area up here, it's Bill's referencing right in here. We've seen a big warm up of the subtropics the last few weeks. In part that we've kind of had a resumption of the Azores high here, but we've seen that area in particular that I've circled really heat up the last 2 or 3 weeks. And, I haven't looked at it that closely, Bill, to be honest, but I would imagine that's got to certainly come into play here in terms of the, potential rainfall that, that could bring with us. I wrote this morning some, research showing that just a modest increase in the SSTs from like 26 degrees Celsius to 29 degrees Celsius, obviously not that warm up here, but just a modest increase in that sea surface temperature can increase the amount of rainfall by up to a factor of 5. So when you see this sort of big warmth that we're seeing near New England, it does make you wonder about the impact it would play into heavy rain events.
Yeah, that was a lot of the studies done immediately after Harvey pointed out the anomalous warmth in the Gulf, which was in the 1 to 1.5 degrees centigrade range then, and how much it contributed to the potential, at least, for the heavy rainfall, all else being equal.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, and I wrote about that, Bill, like you were talking about the record high low temperatures that we're seeing along the Gulf, the high heat indices, all the coral bleaching, all of that's being impacted right now by the warmth. I mean, it's pretty amazing, pretty astounding.
The warmth stays around. We have a weaker than normal subtropical high. It implies slower moving storms.
Yep.
I envision any kind of challenges down here in the south of the warmer water. A storm forms, doesn't have to be a hurricane, and it's moving slowly with that much more water. So the thing I'd kind of be keeping my eye out for is an extreme rain event out of this season.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you go back to 2016 and what happened in Louisiana wasn't even a named system, and brought that sort of rainfall. That's the kind of thing you look for in August and September. Like you said, it doesn't take a big hurricane to have big impacts.
No. So in your position in the job there, how much interaction do you have with the rest of the weather staff?
Oh, every day. We're in close contact. I work very closely with Betty Davis, who's the chief meteorologist at the station, along with the entire team. And it's really a great group. It's the largest group of meteorologists down in South Florida. And I'm really lucky to have such a good team working with me and standing behind me, especially when we have big events like Ian last year. I wasn't sure early on, it kind of looked like maybe Miami. We I hate to use the phrase dodge the bullet, but we missed that one for the most part, which was great. But I've been back to Southwest Florida several times for reporting. Went back, only a week or two after the hurricane. In fact, it was the day that the Sanibel Island Causeway had reopened and got over to Pine Island, Sanibel Island. And, I've seen, like you, Bill, you go on these damage surveys. So I've seen a lot of these, but, and I spent a tremendous amount of time down in Mexico Beach and in the Florida Panhandle after Hurricane Michael. But the breadth of the storm surge, the destruction some of the worst I've seen since Katrina. It was really just phenomenal. And I think every time you go to these hard hit areas, it's a really salient reminder of how destructive these big hurricanes can be.
Yeah, Southwest Florida was my worst case, one of my worst case scenarios over there. It was way too overbuilt into the area, subject to storm surge and evacuations because of the population growth and the age of it was high. And it was also a wind damage issue. We talk about great building codes, but there's a whole lot of old building stock in that part of the state, and it showed up in Ian's damage. It didn't hold up well to those winds.
Definitely. Yeah.
Hal, jump in here. I can tell you got your minds on a high speed right now.
Michael, I really enjoyed the sea surface temperature anomaly maps. In general, will we see a lot of that record warmth water drift from east to west, like with whatever trades are out there, or don't we expect to see it move around that much?
There's definitely some variability. It's not, I suppose we're still early enough in the hurricane season that we have seen a little bit of a reduction in the deep tropical warmth in recent weeks, but I think it would take it's a hard ship to turn. There's a lot of momentum behind the SSTs, and so I mean the pattern that we're seeing right now is probably going to stick around. I mean, it's less of the I guess it's less of the bleeding down of the SSTs from the Azores and more of just the with it being as warm as it is in the sort of northeastern Atlantic, that shuts down the subtropical high, and then we have a reduction in the trade winds, and so that then kicks up the heat within the main development region. So it's kind of that we're seeing. I wouldn't suspect, though, in terms of that kind of horseshoe shaped warmth from the North Atlantic down into the tropics, I don't think that's going to change a whole lot.
Sure.
Until we get to at least through August into September.
Michael, I had to ask you one more question because you're in the Miami metro area. 6 years ago, Hurricane Irma, Miami's kind of on the fringe, but a lot of my friends in South Florida were surprised to see like salt water running down Brickell and these other parts of Miami. Do you think in a way that was an eye opener? I mean, because it wasn't a direct hit, but all of a sudden there was a substantial amount of coastal flooding as far over as Metro Miami. I was curious for your feedback on Irma's impact in Miami and how that maybe helped people realize their risk.
Oh yeah, no, we've seen storms move up the west coast of Florida that have impacted greatly have huge impacts on the east coast of Florida, from Miami all the way up to Jacksonville, and it's interesting, Hal, because that is a really tough nut to crack and to communicate with the general public, especially when you're doing when you're covering a major Cat 4, potentially Cat 5 hurricane landfall. People are drawn naturally to the primary impact zone, and locally you're concerned about what's happening in your neck of the woods, and you see these catastrophic numbers, maybe 10 feet or 15 feet of storm surge, and there's still potential maybe for 5 to 10 feet locally in your area. And so I think for me as a broadcaster, it's how do I, we can talk about the immediate impact area, but then how do I bring viewers back to what is happening in locally in your area, and keeping the focus on what's happening locally, because like I said, especially the bigger hurricanes, if you get enough onshore flow and it's
so with a storm like
running on the streets.
With a storm like Ian, will you kind of communicate to your Miami audience, have one eye on what's happening in the west coast of Florida, but then another eye kind of on, even though locally it's not as extreme, they still want to know those impacts, right?
Right. Yeah. And I mean, that's it. Is I think there's sort of a point where you talk broadly about the hurricane, you talk about the areas that are going to be most greatly impacted, but then at some point you got to sort of turn it a little bit and say, this is what we're going to see, and sort of help the step viewers through this is what we're going to see in our area locally. And that's at the end of the day what matters. But it is kind of a hard turn to make, because you're talking, you're talking so much about the big numbers of the storm. It's kind of hard to move into your local area and talk about things that are still very impactful, but maybe less catastrophic.
Sure. Thanks for that perspective.
Yeah.
Hey, Michael, one of my friends in one of my group chats just posted, it has nothing to do with what we're directly talking about today, but they just said, hey, I see the water temperature in Key West is 92. We're talking about sea surface temperature anomalies. First, is that correct? And two, how unusual is that? Or is it?
Yeah, no, that's right. And that was another thing that I posted in my, if you don't subscribe to my newsletter, I write every day. I write every day about this stuff because I'm a nut. I don't know. I like it. It's interesting to me, and maybe there are other people that find it as interesting as I do. But yeah, no, I pulled up last night. I pulled up all of the historical sea surface temperatures for two coastal stations, Key West and Vaca Key, and did sort of an analysis of the maximum temperature and over the last 30 years or so. And yeah, it's running almost as hot as it's ever been in July. It's in the low 90s. So it's bathwater down there.
That's crazy. One of our viewers is asking how that persistent East Coast trough is affecting the water temperatures in Florida. Is that playing a role? Viewer question.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, we've at the end of the day, I think what's happening with the sea surface temperature, especially in the Gulf and in the Western Atlantic, is I think there is some influence from the reduced trade winds that we've seen from the weaker Azores high. The dust is playing a role too. But I think when you look at especially the Gulf of Mexico, I kind of go back to what. Yeah, I think there's the fingerprints of climate change and global warming on this. I mean, the Gulf has just been on fire the last decade. I mean, most every year in the Gulf has been some record-breaking warmth, and we're seeing it again this year. So I think we can point to a number of things that maybe locally have had some influence in a short period of time, but ultimately, I think the culprit here is climate change and the just overall.
The Gulf's a good one to look at for that because it doesn't have the Atlantic oscillation impact that the Eastern Atlantic would have. So you have to factor that part. It should be running warmer if we're in a busy cycle anyway. So you don't know how much of that to factor out. But the Gulf is kind of a chain reaction feedback mechanism. We're not getting anywhere near the Arctic fronts in the winter, so we're not reducing the heat content as much as normal, and that's been going on for quite some time now.
So Kate and Colin, how do you guys feel about what you're hearing from Michael as we head into the end of the program, but into this season?
Colin, after you. Okay. All right. Well, I mean, I think it's really interesting to hear about this from a meteorologist's perspective and sort of the work that you all do. Just listening to this, it's so fascinating to think about like what we can see coming and what we can't, and what we can attribute to climate change, and what the science is a bit less clear on, but like we kind of intuitively know that it's there, and then how to communicate that to viewers. I think it's just a really fascinating nexus of challenges that you all are thinking about. And yeah, I guess that's my main reflection overall. Like it's really, I welcome the chance to listen in on more of these conversations because I'm learning so much just by being here. And I think the question that Hal asked about Hurricane Irma is a really important one. I was working as a journalist during Irma, and I think that having been in journalism and then I worked in South Florida and some other roles before coming to London, that particular event really does still resonate with people. And yeah, it's an interesting challenge of kind of people falling where the disaster actually is, and obviously the need to bring resources and attention to the people who are most affected, but then also kind of how do we use a storm like Irma that had limited effects in a place like Miami as a teaching moment for thinking about climate change. All of that is really, really interesting as well. So yeah, Colin, any other thoughts?
Well, yeah, I really appreciate, Michael, your perspective. And then the question as to the increased rainfall capacity of a warmed atmosphere, even in non-storm moments, is something I think we need to talk more about with the public. So I live in Fort Lauderdale, and in April, we had 26 inches of rain in a day. It wasn't a tropical storm. and it, FEMA had to come and set up shop because it was nasty, the impacts. And my concern is that because it wasn't linked with a tropical storm, or that it's going to recede from the public memory, or at least the memory of policymakers, and yet it was there were a lot of losses. There were non-monetary impacts that were not trivial. And so even if we had a repeat of that was only 13 inches, just something modest, right? That's still a big deal. And so what we might be needing to prepare for is those types of events even outside of the hurricane season.
Great conversation, y'all. Really, really appreciate it. We're up against the clock. We're coming to the end of the hour, but an important conversation about where we're headed in the insurance world and what this is happening in the Atlantic right now. Fascinating stuff. Before we go, Hal, I want to give you a chance to talk about what's going on GeoTrek this week, because you've had a busy week. You've been in and out a lot. So talk to us real quick about GeoTrek, Hal.
Yeah, just real briefly. We
just lost your audio. Maybe it wasn't meant to be.
Just lost Hal.
Yeah, we lost your audio, Hal. So we'll talk about that next week, it sounds like. So it sounded like you hit something and the audio went away. So we'll get back to that next week. Bill, final thoughts as we wrap up?
No, it's very, very interesting. I think we've identified a lot of things that need to be followed up on and worked on if we're going to have any solutions going forward on that. So appreciate Kate, Colin, and Michael for being with us today to educate us a little bit more on the issues at hand.
Well, and I see another hour very easily with this. It's a great topic, and I think we could go on for a long time yet. So I agree. Colin, Kate, Michael, thank you for being with us today. We appreciate it. Bill, thanks. And Hal, looks like he's jumped out, maybe trying to get back into some audio, but we appreciate everybody. As always, we appreciate our sponsors, USAA, the South Padre Island Convention and Visitors Bureau, the Weather Company, and Weather Boy. They make these programs a possibility week in and week out. Next week on the program, Jason Sipple will be back with us. If you know Jason, Google him. If you don't, check it out. It's going to be another great conversation. That's next week, same time, 10 a.m. Central Time, right here on NTWC Live. Until then, take care. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of NTWC Live Hurricane Center Podcast. If you did, head over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a 5-star review. And join us next week